right, so it still might be loading for you guys, but you should hopefully see, I'm going to start my webcam here. Let's see, you should see me in just 1 second. Hello, everyone. So you see me, and hopefully you hear me now too. You can also hear that I'm maybe a little stuffed up today. So I apologize if you maybe hear me, hopefully not sneezing or coughing too much, but with the crazy change in temperatures here in New Orleans and everywhere you guys are, you know, I'm sure there's a lot of people that have the sniffles today. So please bear with me. But today we have a really awesome program. We here at the World War II Museum in New Orleans, there's me, Chrissy, and then Megan. Do you want to pop in and say wave?
Hi.
Megan will be managing that Q&A pod you see below me. We really encourage you guys to type in questions throughout the presentation. We'll try to answer what we can. We're going to have a Q&A session with both us and the Yankee Air Museum at the end. And if we don't get to your question, feel free to include your email as well when you type in the question, and we're happy to answer it later as well. So that is for you guys to input any sorts of questions, you know, about this topic. And Megan will be kind of looking at that and managing it throughout the session. Also, joining us in a little bit are the folks from the Yankee Air Museum. We have Randy, he's the historian on Willow Run, and Rachel, who is the director of education at the Yankee Air Museum in Belleville, Michigan. The cool thing about this sort of technology is that we can connect with all of you guys from many different places, but also have this really neat opportunity to have two different museums present to you on this topic. So, as I said, I'm really, as you can tell, like really excited today that we're able to do this. So it'll be the first 20 minutes or so will be me, and then Randy and Rachel will take over at the Yankee Air Museum. So what we're going to do today, though, to kind of start you guys off, start your brains, working and all that sort of stuff, is that I'm going to ask you guys a question, and a poll question. For some of you folks that have done this before, this might look familiar, but some of you newbies, this might be different and new. You can see here I'm opening up a poll in Adobe Connect. And I want you guys to answer this question to start off today. After what event did the United States officially enter World War II? And you can make your selection in there, as you can see. Germany invaded Poland, Japan invaded China, Germany attacked England in the Battle of Britain, or Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. I'll give you a second. It looks like you guys are super smart. You know your stuff. I'm going to broadcast it so you can see how smart you are. You guys are exactly right. And maybe you know this because you're studying World War II right now, but also because the anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor is quickly approaching here. 100% saying yes, it's that fourth choice there. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. And this is really where our story starts today. So that's why I asked you this question. There'll be a few more poll questions throughout the presentation here. So that happened December 7th of 1941. And then this very famous speech happened the day after, I think.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
You can hear me. Okay, now you can hear me. So you know that is a very famous speech by a very famous individual, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. That was the day after the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 8th of 1941. He is addressing Congress to ask them to declare war on Japan, which does happen. 3 days after that, Germany declares war on the United States. So within the matter of this very devastating, very tragic event, and within the matter of the days after, the United States is at war. And we talk about this a lot, of course, at our museum, how war changes the lives of almost every single American. Our military is tiny at this point, but very soon, within World War II, we have 16 million Americans serving in uniform, men and women. So in addition to that, though, we have people here working on the home front, and that's what we're really focusing on today. And actually leads me to my second poll question in just 1 second. So you guys know that we need people serving overseas, but we also need people who are working in factories here, building all of these products, building all of these materials we need to win a war. And that's actually the next poll question for you guys. This one is a little bit different here. This is where you type in your answer. So I want to know from you all, what sort of materials and equipment do you need to win a war? And you can be kind of broad or you can be very specific. So I'm going to let you guys type in for a second, and then I'm going to broadcast some of those results. What kind of materials do you need to win a war, or at least fight in a war? Okay, I'm going to start broadcasting these results so you guys can see them. If someone said everything, excuse me, I think that's a really good response. Food, raw materials, steel, airplanes, ships, ammunitions, yes. You guys are creating this huge, long list, as you should, because you need a lot of different materials to win, or, at least to participate in a war. And the United States, had to be ready for this. Not only the people who were serving, but also people here on the home front who are building these very, very critical materials. And we usually think of like the big stuff. People are mentioning, bombs, jeeps, planes, tanks, that sort of thing. But even these factories and these plants that are building the smallest things, they matter too. What I'm going to show you now, I'm going to close out this poll. We're going to see our first video today, first video clip. And what I'm going to do is pause my video and audio, and hopefully this will play nice and smoothly for you all. But this is a newsreel. People would see little short clips like this, little news stories, before they would go to see a show in a movie theater. Remember, there's no television or no internet back then. So this was one of the ways you could get news, and you'd see these kind of short little fast-paced clips. This one is all about production, and I think it brings up some really important points. So I'm going to bring that up. I'm going to close out the poll. You guys were really good at that. I'm going to bring up this clip right now. As I said, I'm going to pause myself, but I'll be coming back.
American industry has met the challenge of war. American factories have achieved the impossible. American mass production is delivering the goods. Going first to the great automobile assembly lines, capable of turning out 4 million trucks and passenger cars a year, United States engineers harnessed the skill, mobilized the resources of the most efficient manufacturing system in the world. Peacetime construction was halted. Overnight, tons of machinery and hundreds of plants were hauled away for the duration by workmen converting to war. Armed guards took over. The nation's key factories, already charted for just such an emergency, were equipped and made ready. In hundreds of peaceful towns, the main streets of America, thousands of small industries were fitted into the National War Production Plan. Performing manufacturing miracles. Workmen in Denver, Colorado, for example, make parts and fashion tools that may help build a battleship in a Navy yard 1,000 miles away. Small stuff. The billions of bits and pieces. 100,000 different parts in a single flying fortress. And every possible plant that could be retooled is turning them out, feeding them to the big assembly lines night and day.
Okay, so hopefully that played for everyone. Just so you know, if some of you have some Wi-Fi connections that might not be working totally right, those clips, we're recording this program, so you'll be able to watch those full clips, later as well. So if it's not playing for you right, But that clip there just brought up a lot of important ideas about production here in the United States during World War II. First off, factories in cities and towns across this country were converting for war. I betcha there was a factory not too far from where you guys are right now that was producing something for World War II. May not exist today anymore, but if you did a little research on your local town or city, I bet you could find that. They were converting for war, which means they were, let's say a factory was making refrigerators before World War II. Well, now they're making airplane parts, now that the country is at war. You also saw, too, that in that clip that, these factories that were making the tiniest of parts, the little bits, the billions and bits and pieces, as that narrator said, they were just as important as these huge assembly lines. Later, as we connect with the Yankee Air Museum, we're going to talk about the largest assembly line at Willow Run. And then every single person had a role to play in these factories, whether they had a specific step on the assembly line or, as you saw, making these little teeny tiny parts. Everybody was important to this, to this production machine. So our main presentation today here at the museum is we're talking about what was going on here in New Orleans. But before we really focus on that, I'm going to show you some amazing, staggering production numbers. So check it out, what we built here in the United States in about 3.5 years of war. 27 aircraft carriers, 352 destroyers, that's a type of large ship, 88,000 tanks, wow, 300,000 airplanes, just gets bigger from here, 26 million machine guns, and 41 billion with a B bullets. So pretty crazy. Think of all the other stuff you came up with, what we need for war. Think of the huge quantities of those things. All right, so as I said, we're focusing on New Orleans today, but we're focusing on this specific problem here. So sometimes, there were problems that our men and women in the military faced, and they needed something to fix that problem. They needed some sort of equipment, some sort of machinery to fix that problem. So here's one of the problems. It's difficult, during World War II to invade port cities because they're usually heavily defended by an enemy. How do you land millions and millions of troops in these overrun continents across the world where these harbors are in enemy hands? So you can't bring your big ships and all of your equipment to a harbor. It's hard to attack a port. So someone here, actually in New Orleans, has a solution. His name is Andrew Higgins. He's a New Orleans boat builder. And he created these small amphibious craft that were able to actually land, not, in these big harbors, but they could actually even land on beaches. You guys see a map behind me of the Pacific, but also think of World War II. The war occurred in many different places all across this world, many that had beaches and coastlines. And we could land potentially anything on these coastlines. That's what Andrew Higgins thought. So I'm going to show you a little clip in just a second about Andrew Higgins, but I'm going to bring up, I used the word earlier, this word amphibious earlier. A lot of students, like, what does that mean? So I'm going to have you guys vote on this. What does that word amphibious mean? And I'm going to broadcast it in just 1 second. All right, looks like most of you are voting. Let me show it to you now. Yeah, it's, as most of you said, something that's suited to both land and water. You've probably heard that word amphibian before, like a frog. Something that could, these amphibious craft, these landing craft that Higgins eventually creates, they could bring anything from tanks to troops, from a big a ship out in open water, all the way to a beach. And they were really, revolutionized how we invaded these places that were surrounded by water or had some sort of coastline. But instead of me describing that, I'm actually going to have, there's one of these landing craft designs right here. But I'm going to actually show you a video about that right here, about Higgins.
It starts in the bayous of Louisiana. During the 1930s, oil companies and trappers need boats that can navigate the shallow waters. In New Orleans, Andrew Jackson Higgins begins a small shipbuilding company to build those boats. One of his designs, the Eureka, was to be the forerunner of a whole series of amphibious craft that would play a critical role in the coming war.
Beginning of World War II, the United States had no capability for amphibious landing, period. And Andrew Higgins had an idea.
Throughout military history, it had been nearly unthinkable to attack a heavily defended coastline from the sea. But Higgins believed his craft could do the job. First, however, he had to get the attention of the Navy. To the Bureau of Ships, Higgins was just a small boat dealer from the Deep South. But Higgins was shrewd and persistent. Finally, he got the Navy's attention.
He got the contract by force of his aggressive Irish personality in part, but also because the Higgins boat was the best boat ever designed for that purpose.
Soon he was designing and building boats that could land anything from tanks to troops. With the addition of a ramp, these landing craft proved far superior to anything the Bureau of Ships had seen. Massive orders started pouring in. Long assembly lines churned out boats 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 700 boats a month. Over 25,000 workers, including women and African Americans. Higgins Industries touched every neighborhood, every street, and every family in New Orleans.
It was really a team effort, you know, a company-wide, from top to bottom effort. Everybody could put their 2 cents in.
All right, so there's a little bit of Higgins history for you. Now, Higgins, as you heard in that video, he initially had a hard time getting the attention of the military. But with persistence, with the superior product that you could hear the narrator, Harry Connick Jr., say, could land anything from tanks to troops, you know, he had the superior product that could get the job done. He was soon competing with the more established shipyards in the Northeast, and Higgins' designs won him these huge government contracts. And his tiny business that only had, you know, a few people working in it before World War II, a handful, now had potentially thousands of workers here in New Orleans mobilized. And there's some really interesting stories behind Higgins, too. This is one of the big ones here. Now, these Higgins craft were used in every major amphibious landing during World War II. So, North Africa, the Mediterranean, the Pacific, but also, of course, most famously during D-Day. And this is, you guys have maybe seen this picture before if you've talked about D-Day, the largest amphibious invasion in history. There was a question someone asked, wasn't it difficult to land things on the beach? And that answer is, yeah, definitely was. And you can even see that illustrated in this picture. Sometimes they couldn't get quite all the way to the beach. And these troops are wading through these kind of knee-deep, waist-deep water to get to the beaches of Normandy. But these craft played a critical role, especially in this invasion. D-Day opened up a second front in Europe, and eventually these troops would make their way from France into Belgium, into Germany, and within months, the war would be over, 11 months after opening the second front here. As I said, the largest amphibious invasion in history, taking over 175,000 people mobilized, and 150,000 of those landing on these beaches here. So that's why, this craft is so important to the story of World War II and to the story of our museum here. So this is probably my favorite image of Higgins Industries, though. This is, those Higgins boats. Their technical name is LCVP, Landing Craft for Vehicles and Personnel, being pushed out of the factories here. And I love that slogan at the top here. The guy who will relaxes is helping the axis, as pushing everybody to work as hard as they possibly can to to produce these amazing numbers of all these different materials. It was this common viewpoint shared by many people working in these factories at the time. And this is an interesting story too. This is kind of a makeshift assembly line on the street. Higgins won this contract to build these tank lighters, and he was supposed to deliver 50 of them to the military within 2 weeks. That was kind of a difficult thing to achieve, and actually at this one point they even had to bring the assembly line out onto the street. So this is a New Orleans street, to get it done. So sometimes even innovative and interesting ways of getting these materials produced. Now I'm just going to briefly talk about this because I know the folks at Willow Run at Yankee Air Museum will talk about this more, but of course all of these factory jobs, this demand for workers and people to work in these factories 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, meant potentially new workers coming into the field for the first time. And of course one of those groups were women. You heard the Rosie the Riveter song over and over again. There's that very famous poster of Rosie, and actually the women back there are welders from Delta Shipbuilding Company. So there were over, I think, 6 million women who went to work, in these defense jobs during World War II, doing kind of some of this really hard labor sort of stuff. And the next clip I wanted to show you, I think that's what's next. It's actually women at Higgins. Specifically, this woman's name is Edna Donnelly. This is one of my favorite oral histories from the museum. She talks about her first day at Higgins. She and her mom were welders. It was a little bit overwhelming, but they eventually got used to it.
Women didn't work much at that time. You didn't hear of too many women going out to work, but we did because they didn't have enough men to do all the work, so in the shipyard, and they had to hire women too. My mom decided that she and I were going to go to work at Higgins. So we went and see what we could do. And the first day I walked in the shipyard, I never forget that because it was so frightening, all the noise. I went to work in the fabrication department where they put the bulkheads together. They had all these riggers rigging all this metal over your head, as you was walking along, all this big sheets of metal passing over your head. I'll never forget that first day they put that shield on my head. They didn't tell me what I had to do or anything, and I put the thing down and I couldn't see anything. It was black. I said, well, how am I going to do anything? I can't see nothing. I didn't think I'd make it. I said, oh, I doubt if I'll stay here a whole day. And then I did. And then I stayed a week, and I stayed longer and longer. And then finally, well, we were at it. Mama, she liked it. She really did. And Mama, she stayed, and eventually she got to be a certified welder. And that's her biggest story now, is to tell everybody how she was a welder.
All right, you guys have lots of wonderful questions that Megan's answering right now. But yeah, as I said, that's one of my favorite clips from our museum of Edna. And her story is like many women who went to war. Now at Higgins, in 1938, he operated a single boatyard, less than 75 workers, and by late 1943, there were 7 plants, employed more than 25,000 workers. The first plant to be racially integrated, including whites, blacks, women, seniors, people with disabilities. And even though women were in the workforce before World War II, more than 6 million of them engaged in industrial work. Though, as we'll see as we study later history post-war, female workers, many of them were forced to leave their jobs as men returned home from the war. They kind of became the model of, and Rosie the Riveter became the model for the women's liberation movement, which would happen later, in our history, in our American history. And they became the model of, these tough women who went to work and, who deserved equal opportunity. Similar, story here in some ways with African Americans. Now, as I said, there's a tremendous demand now to have skilled labor in these factories. And because of that, racial inequality and other aspects of life on the home front came to light during these times while trying to recruit a labor force for this industry. Factory work could be segregated, and women and minorities in some cases, in many cases actually, received unequal pay for equal work. And as I said, these men and women who worked in these factories, they, in some ways paved the way for these future changes in labor. And they were models for necessity, for equal opportunity for women, for African Americans, leading, to the civil rights movement, and as I said earlier, to the women's liberation movement from the 1950s or so to 1970s. But factory work, as I said, was sometimes segregated. But many African Americans were provided new opportunities as President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 8802, which prohibited discrimination in factories that were awarded defense contracts. So it eased some of this, but there was still some discrimination, of course, there, potentially even race rioting as well, and still unequal pay for very, very equal work. But as I said, these folks that were in these factories, paved the way for these future movements that we study in American history. As I said, I'm just touching on that right now, but that's something you'll talk about in your class later. But getting back to Higgins, though, Higgins, along with some other industries here in the United States, some other companies, here were awarded the E for Excellence Award by the U.S. government. And that's what actually we see in this picture here. They're celebrating that. Behind them is the 10,000th Higgins boat, so there's a big ceremony. And Higgins Industries here during World War II in total, they constructed 20,000 vessels and close to 12,000 of those LCVPs, what we call Higgins boats. Eisenhower, who was a general during World War II, later in life he said that Higgins won the war for us. But, in some ways, actually, everyone, this story, although important to New Orleans, important to our history, important to World War II, is not unique. There were things like this happening all across the country during World War II, and that's actually where I turn and toss it over now to our friends at the Yankee Air Museum. We'll have Randy and Rachel come on in just one second, and they're going to talk about the amazing feats of production at Willow Run. This assembly line, this over mile-long assembly line, where they produced B24 bomber planes, employing thousands and thousands of people. And at one point, they could produce one bomber plane, I think, per hour. And the bomber had, I think, over 1.5 million different parts. And so there are people working on this long, long assembly line and being able to churn out one of these humongous planes, one of the largest aircraft that were built during World War II, within an hour. So a tremendous feat of production at Willow Run. And so I'm going to turn it over to them right now. Let's see if they're all connected.
Hello.
So Randy and Rachel, I might
Good.
your mic up, but the video up. I'm going to turn it over to you guys.
Talk about I'm going to mute my video and my audio.
Hey there, Randy. How you doing?
Take it away, Alfie.
Good. Well, as I said, I'm
This
going to
slide.
turn it over to you guys to talk about Willow Run.
You see a poster here that says, "Watch the Fords go by," an old marketing slogan, but you don't see any cars in that picture. You see this big 4-engine bomber. Next slide. World War II would be a bomber war. Bombers would be the way the United States would fight World War II, and the United States elected to mass produce bombers. The bombers ultimately would probably save hundreds of thousands of U.S. lives by destroying our enemies. Airplane production and bomber production would be the biggest problems the U.S. faced in World War II, and only the auto companies had the ability to build those airplanes. Next slide. Next slide. Oh, did you hear me? Next slide. Detroit is where the masters at GM and Ford had perfected mass production. And they did this by the ability to produce huge volumes of standardized precision parts. And this allowed a potential rapid buildup of production. And one of the side stories that's not widely known, 85% of the cars in the world were registered in the United States in 1940. The farm boys and the high school hot rodders knew how to fix things. The U.S. was mechanically literate, and that gave the U.S. a tremendous advantage in the field. Next slide. Just after midnight on May 10, 1940, President Roosevelt received a phone call from the ambassador to Belgium. The ambassador reported that the German army had crossed the borders in France, Belgium, and Holland. In 10 days, the German blitzkrieg had defeated the combined armies of France, England, Belgium, and Holland. The war in Europe had taken on a new urgency, and although the U.S. did not want to become involved, it could not be avoided. At this time, the U.S. had neither an army or an air force that ranked in the top 10 worldwide. Next slide. General George Marshall, Army Chief of Staff, visits Roosevelt and tells him, "There is no longer time to waste. The way we've been doing things will not work. We must act now. You must bring the industrialists into this mobilization." And FDR knew that it was no ordinary time. It was time for bold action. He needed to mobilize the U.S. So he went to Congress and called for production of 50,000 airplanes. This was a number beyond comprehension. When Hermann Göring, head of the German Luftwaffe, heard this, he laughed and said, "That's pure propaganda. No one can build 50,000 airplanes." 4 years later, the U.S. would build 100,000 airplanes. President Roosevelt was about to turn to Detroit's industrialists to solve the nation's mobilization emergency. Next slide. Detroit was about to be asked to save the world. FDR asked a close friend, Bernard Baruch, who would be the best person to head up the mobilization of the United States. Baruch said, "There's only one man who knows what to do and how to do it, and that's William Knudsen, president of General Motors." 18 months prior to Pearl Harbor, the president of General Motors was about to be asked to come to Washington to mobilize the United States. William Knudsen, a Danish immigrant who came to the U.S. in 1900. He had worked his way up the auto industry at Ford and GM. He was known by and respected by almost everyone in the auto industry. Next slide. Knudsen knows it's going to take 18 months to have the machine tools in place. It'll take another 18 months for production to peak. This means the U.S. will be on the defensive for 3 years, and it'll be the summer of 43 before the U.S. might can be seen in the field. He knows that aircraft and engine tooling would be the biggest problems they face, and he knows that only the auto companies have the ability to do this. Next slide. Summer of 1940, orders go out for tens of thousands of airplanes. Congress says, "Oh, those companies will make too much money, we'll slash the profits." Well, the auto companies and the aircraft companies go, "Well, we won't build anything then because we're selling everything we have overseas." And the Army really doesn't want the auto companies involved, and the aircraft companies don't want the auto companies involved because they're afraid of post-war competition. Next slide. On October 15, 1940, Knudsen goes to the auto show in New York City at Madison Square Garden. As the dinner ended, he stood up and asked the attendees to bear with him. He had a request to make. And he said in his broken Danish accent, "We need more bombers than we can hope to get. We need them sooner than we can hope to get them. Will you help me get them? I want to meet with you soon in Detroit." Next slide. The Automen gathered 2 weeks later at the New Center building in Detroit. Everyone who was anyone in the auto industry was there. Ford, GM, Briggs, Fisher Body, Budd, Studebaker, to name a few. Once inside the building, the Automen met a panel that Knudsen had assembled. It was composed of Army Air Corps officers and aviation executives and engineers. Detroit was about to be turned loose to solve the bomber production bottleneck. This project was not the brainchild of some theorist, politician, or educator, but a proposal from Knudsen, someone who truly understood the capabilities and limitations of the automakers, and he was a true patriot. Next slide. Next slide, okay. Major Jimmy Doolittle, famed for his daring Tokyo raid, led the Army Air Corps men. He held a PhD in aeronautical engineering from MIT. He'd been recalled to active duty in July as an act of Congress. But he was assigned to Detroit as a technical advisor to the auto industry. In his words, he was to perform a shotgun marriage between the auto industry and the aircraft industry. Doolittle had laid out blueprints and a series of engine and airframe parts at the nearby Graham Page factory in western Detroit. He took the automakers there and said, "Here are the parts we need. Pick out the ones you can build. I will get you a contract." And these contracts drifted down to the small shops who made the small parts to make the bigger parts. Next slide. The B-24 was the biggest problem that the Army faced. It was slow production. It was an advanced airplane. In December, Doolittle visited Henry Ford in Dearborn. Doolittle was hoping Ford could build parts and be the answer to the B-24 production bottleneck and speed up production of the B-24. Consolidated was only producing one bomber a day. The B-24 was the most problematic airplane that the Army had at that time. Next slide. They were hoping that Ford could break that bottleneck because Ford had the largest centralized manufacturing facility in the world, a place where raw materials came in on a truck at one end and cars drove out the other end. Ford could be the answer. Next slide. The next month, Charles Sorensen, head of Ford production, would visit Reuben Fleet's Consolidated B-24 factory in San Diego. Sorensen wanted to determine the feasibility of producing parts for B-24s. What Sorensen observed was a disappointment. He viewed the major aspects of Consolidated's production with disdain. It was obvious to everyone except the Consolidated people that Ford's precision parts with 2,000 10,000ths of an inch would never fit with Consolidated's handcrafted parts. Sorensen told Consolidated he neither liked what he saw or what he heard. He said, "All this is pretty discouraging." Fleet and his engineers looked at Sorensen and said, "So how would you do it?" Sorensen loved the challenge and answered, "I don't know, but I'll have an answer for you in the morning." Next slide. Sorensen went back to his room, and the nation was about to be shocked by Mr. Sorensen's proposal. In his imagination, there would be no mere parts factory. It would become the vortex of President Roosevelt's arsenal of democracy. Back up one slide. He went to his room at the Coronado Hotel in North Island. He was too restless to sleep. Using his notes from the day and his 35 years of manufacturing experience, he broke the B-24 bomber down into sub-assemblies, section by section. He figured out average job performance, time, flow, and overhead cost. There were stacks of papers and lines all over his room. By 4 a.m., he had the proper sequence down, production time allotted. Then he sketched out the floor plan of a bomber plant that would produce one B-24 bomber an hour. The floor plan showed an assembly line a mile long and a quarter mile wide. Next slide. Sorensen went back the next morning to Fleet's office with his papers under his arms. He said to Fleet, Ford could build a B-24 bomber an hour in an automotive-style assembly line. Fleet was somewhat dazed by the scale of Sorensen's proposal and said, "You're crazy. No one can do that." Sorensen's jaw set and he responded, "We're not interested in sub-assemblies. We'll make a complete airplane or nothing." The world was about to discover what Detroit could do. Next slide. Sorensen had just taken on the biggest project of his life when he committed Ford Motor Company to build a 4-engine bomber an hour. On the basis of pencil drawings on hotel stationery, the Army was so desperate for airplanes that they awarded a $200 million contract to build the bombers and the bomber plant. It was the largest single contract ever awarded in that time of the history of the United States. Sorensen was in a hurry to find 4 square miles of flat land near Detroit. And he picked a piece of flat land near Ypsilanti, Michigan, by a sleepy little creek known as the Willow Run. In April of 1941, Ground was broken on a bomber plant that would be called the Willow Run Bomber Plant. Next slide. People were evicted from their land here to make sure that this plant could be built. Next slide. Next slide. The factory was built on Washtenaw County, west of Detroit, and it would have extended into Wayne County. Henry Ford didn't want that, so the famous thing is there's a 90-degree turn in the assembly line to keep the factory in Washtenaw County so he could build trucks, tractors, or cars and not have to cross a county line after the war. Next slide. The plant was under construction. 6 months after they broke ground, they were already producing parts in here. Next slide. By November 1941, 18 months after Knudsen came to Detroit, before Pearl Harbor, all the major weapons to be used in World War II were identified, plants being built, and under production. In 18 months, this avalanche of material would crush the Axis. Next slide. 1941, December, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. If the U.S. had waited till the Pearl Harbor attack to mobilize, we might not have been able to respond until the winter of 45 or the summer of 46 to this attack, and history could have a much different line than it does today. Next slide. Called the Battle of Detroit in Time magazine, they quoted saying that this was something Hitler did not understand, the miracle of American production. He fully understood the miracle of American production. He feared it, but based on the German experience, he thought it would be 4 years before we could respond. Next slide. Big problems came out. When Ford got the B24 contract, they asked Consolidated for the blueprints. And Consolidated said, we don't have any blueprints. We got drawings, sketches, etc. And Ford had to do 30,000 engineering drawings. That put them about 6 months behind. Now the war comes. Men are being drafted. Men are volunteering for the service. And they start hiring women off the street. Women don't leave like the men do because they're not being drafted. And slowly the women in the workforce build up. Next slide. Production is stalled because of the tooling and the manpower and other problems coming up. So the bomber plant is renamed Willow Run. And the Truman Committee, looking for fraud in manufacturing, comes into Detroit. Next slide. And they look at what's going on at Willow Run, and there's high employee turnover. The male workers are leaving. There's no housing. It's a sub-assembly plant being directed through a hierarchy. Nobody will freeze the designs. And because they changed the design, they can't get production going. Next slide. Truman Committee gives Ford a clean bill of health and says nobody can run a factory. What you need to do is get a dictator in this factory. And they appointed a plant manager who had the ability to farm out manufacturing, hire more women, freeze designs, and B24 production takes off. Next slide. Employment peaks in 1943 at 42,000. And as I said, because of the lower turnover of women to men, the women increase in the bomber factory. They make up 40% of the war. They move into supervisory roles. And these women were motivated by much more than the pay. The women were motivated by a bigger calling because they all had brothers, sons, boyfriends, husbands overseas. And we had an interview with one Rosie, and she talked about, she came in early in 1942, and she was a riveter on the cockpit. And after
Uh-oh, looks like we lost Randy's audio. And webcam. We're going to give them a second to start back up so they can start talking about Willow Run and the employment of all these Rosie the Riveters. As they're getting this started up, probably this plant is the most famous for those women who went to work at the war. So I'm going to let them get back signed in and they can talk about it a little more. I want to tell you all, just as a side note, you are providing so many wonderful questions, and Megan and Rachel there are, doing their best to answer all of them. So, so this is really, really great that you guys are, I think this is the most questions that we have ever had. So you'll see Megan, it says me technically, but you'll see Megan responding to them, but also, of course, Rachel as well, if you see her chiming in as well, the Director of Education at the Yankee Air Museum. We're just going to give them another second to get connected again. Let's see here, and looks like they're back on now. And I'm going to give them a second, excuse me, to get connected one more time.
All right, let's
pick up the story. All right,
here we go. Back again.
I don't know how much you missed, but I'm going to go back to the interview we had. One of the Rosies we interviewed here.
Sure.
She came to work.
Sure.
Did you get that?
Yeah, that'd be great.
You already heard that story. Okay.
We did not hear that story.
We did not hear that story.
What happened was a woman came to work here in early 1942, and she was riveting the cockpit floor for the pilots. And after about 6 months, she was doing a good job. They appointed her supervisor, and they gave her a metal die, and no cockpit floor was to leave her department unless she put her initials on it. And 50 years later, she still had that die. She was so proud of her role. And she said, "No floor left my department unless it was perfect. I had to do my part for the boys overseas because they were our husbands, our boyfriends, our brothers." Another thing, Ford paid men and women the same from day one. That was just one of his equal opportunity things. Next slide. I'm going to go through these next series of slides, and you'll see the enormity of this factory and all of the jigs and production tools. Next slide. And you see the prefabricated parts all going together. They're all identical. They're pre-fit. They snap together like a set of Legos. Next slide. You see the rows of the riveters here actually driving the rivets to put this wing together. And a good riveter could do 6 rivets a minute, and they were driving them by that rate, millions per day. Next. And you see the center wing now going on the assembly line. They start adding all the parts to it. Next slide. The cockpits with all the wiring, all the tubing are being put together. Next slide. And you can see the women putting the prefabricated parts on the wings as the airplane comes down the assembly line. This airplane you're looking at right there will be flying in 5 days. Next line. And you see them coming to the 90-degree turn. Now go through these really quick, and you'll see there's 2 parallel assembly lines with 90 airplanes under production at any one time. And they're all moving. Every 2 hours, these airplanes will move forward to keep that bomber an hour production rate. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. You see them going into the paint booth and coming out the door once an hour. Incidentally, this is the part of the factory that the museum here has saved, and this is going to be our future home. The Willow Run Bomber Plant will now be open to the public in about 4 years. Next slide. You can see they built the first airplane in October 42. A year later, they were doing 365 a month. They could have gone to 650, but the Army literally said, "We have no place to park them. Slow down." Next slide. By 1944, 50% of the bomber weight and 75% of the bomber engines are coming from Detroit. Next slide. Next slide. Women make up 40% of the workforce. They would not have been able to build the bombers without the women. There was such a shortage of manpower in this country that women were brought in, not for equal opportunity, not because they needed to, but because they could do the job, and they got these bombers. There would have not have been the bomber force without the women. Next slide. Last bomber comes off the assembly line, June of 1945, and we say farewell here at Willow Run to the bomber. Next slide. There you see the last airplane built there with the single tail coming off the assembly line. It wasn't actually the last one. It was going to be the last model they built. And that became the major airport in Detroit, and that road at the bottom became Interstate 94 when Eisenhower did the Interstate Act. Next slide. Was Willow Run a success? Well, yes and no. Production peaked after the war had basically been won, but if the war had gone badly, had 44 been like 42 or 43, they would have desperately needed the production. Willow Run was making a pound of airframe in half the time of the industry standard. Next slide. Next slide. Following World War II, the Army evaluated the auto industry contribution to production and said the question of whether the auto industry could be converted to production aircraft was settled beyond debate during the war. The success left no room for argument. And given the limited capacity of the aircraft industry and the enormous pressure for airplanes after May of 1940, it's fair to conclude the Army Air Force was justified in underwriting the Ford experiment. Willow Run was the manifestation of the miracle of Detroit's manufacturing mastery. Next slide. This is what the factory looked like. The little red square there on the right is the part we have saved for our future museum. Next slide. And this is what it looks like today. You can see our part there at the end of the assembly line. I thank you very much for letting me make this presentation. Open to Q&A.
Thank you so much, Randy. I'm going to pop back on 2 minutes. And I know we're going to have a little bit of a delay, everyone, so bear with us. So we've had some wonderful questions, probably the most that we've ever had in one webinar, which is crazy. What did you say, Megan? Like 40 or 50 questions, at least. So we've had some really wonderful ones. So we've been trying to answer them privately with you all, but I actually have a couple of questions that I thought would be great to answer as a group. A lot of people, were curious. You talked about this a couple bit, the fate of Willow Run after 1945. What happened to it? And a lot of people, were curious. Are going to the rest of it going to be the fate of Willow Run after 1945. The part that you guys are going to have the rest of it going to be demolished. What's the story of it after 1945?
What happened to the factory after 1945? It was given to the University of Michigan, and the University of Michigan then sold it to Kaiser Fraser Corporation to build cars there, and they built cars till 1953, and then General Motors transmission factory burnt down, and General Motors bought the bomber plant and built transmissions there until 2010, when as part of the bankruptcy, they eliminated this from their production facilities.
That's really, really amazing. So when will the Yankee Air Museum?
Wow. So you guys, that part of the term. So that's really, really amazing. So when will the Yankee Air Museum?
It looks like your volume.
I don't know. Is it at the webinar or is that?
Yeah, I know everybody. So
it looks like your volume.
Speaker volume.
You're breaking up.
I'm echoing. Yeah, I know everybody
here.
So, if you could turn speaker volume.
All right, that should be better.
I don't think I'll much. Everybody's maybe here.
Something down or up.
So when will you guys be in that facility?
That was loud and clear.
So when will you guys be in that facility?
We plan to open part of it to the public in the spring of 2017.
And you'll have a new name, right?
And that's our goal, and to have it up and running by 2018.
Wow. And you'll have a new name, right?
Yes, we do. And it's the National Museum of Aviation and
that is just
Technology,
great. I just want to thank
historic Willow Run.
We're running a little low on time, so I just want to thank everyone for spending time with us today. Randy and Rachel, any final things you want to say to the audience? It looks like you're on mute. I'm sorry about that. Rachel, if you wouldn't mind connecting that one more time. Yeah, technology.
Okay, all I can say is if you're in the area, come visit us. We got a lot of fantastic things to show here. And
Thank you very much, you guys, for participating today. Such a neat story. I learned so much about Willow Run. I had no idea about Consolidated not even having blueprints or all that sort of stuff, the crazy things and the amazing feats that happened at this place. So hopefully, as I said, I can get up there one day too and see you guys at the museum. I'm going to transition into another area right now to close it all out. You guys have been a wonderful, super awesome audience. As I said, most questions we've ever gotten. Like, it's crazy. the participation was at its max. If we haven't answered all of your questions, you can feel free to submit your email, and we could try to answer them after the webinar as well, so we can answer them that way. A couple things to remind you of here in this area. First off, on that slide, you see that Pearl Harbor is about 2 weeks or so from now. And we don't have a special webinar on it this year because we did this one. But I want to remind you all that we did a really cool one last year with author Graham Salisbury. He wrote the book Under the Blood Red Sun. It was actually just turned into a film, if you guys are interested. It's a really great Q&A with him and a great overview of the attack on Pearl Harbor. So there's a link there. We've got lesson plans and fact sheets on it. And also a few years ago, we had a special exhibit about it. So you can see artifacts from that special exhibit. So that's what's on that slide. Now, resources related to the things that we've been talking about today. So you see resources for teachers below that. So that's a lesson plan, an activity, and a fact sheet that actually my coworker Megan, who's been answering your questions, that she put together related to our special exhibit that is currently up called Manufacturing Victory, the Arsenal of Democracy. So a lot of the things that you saw today were from that. Also related to that are really important links. So the special exhibit website, which is the top there, the Manufacturing Victory one, our educational resources at the museum, of course, the Yankee Air Museum. And some of you might have been asking numbers about production, like how many of this sort of thing did we make? How many of that sort of thing? That World War II by the numbers is a great, answers a lot of those questions. And then last but not least, I am always curious. We are planning to do more of these webinars. We do try to do 4 of them per school year. So teachers, see that little poll at the end there. Select which webinar you'd be most interested in watching. Hopefully, as a little hint to you guys watching live, I plan to do all of these. We're still working out the details for some, but I would really like to see what you all would be most interested in participating in the future. As I said, we'll also continue to answer your questions. We'll try to via email, any of those that didn't get answered. Big shout out, big thank you to Rachel and Randy from the Yankee Air Museum. As I said, we'll learn so much from you guys. And I hope everybody has a wonderful Friday, a wonderful weekend, and a wonderful Thanksgiving. From Megan and Chrissy at the National WWII Museum in New Orleans,